So we let Robbie go since, as you could probably tell, he was rapidly losing his voice. Get some rest, Robbie, but let's press on without him. The DeSantis versus Disney drama over the so-called Don't Say Gay bill continues. This time, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis is targeting Disney's special status, which gives the company more autonomy to oversee what goes on its property. Disney has enjoyed these privileges since 1968. DeSantis called a special legislative session on Tuesday to redraw 2 congressional districts in such a way that would split the Reedy Creek Improvement District, where Disney is located. But critics of DeSantis' latest move say it could suppress the black vote. Here to discuss what many view as retaliation against Disney for speaking out against the parental rights education law dubbed Don't Say Gay bill and potential impact on voters are Max Alvarez, editor-in-chief of The Real News, and Newsweek contributor Denise Long. Welcome to you both.
Good morning.
Thanks for having us.
So, Denise, do you see this as retaliation for Disney's winging in on the Don't Say Gay bill?
Yeah. So what I envision is that DeSantis, as the governor, is leveraging all of the power that he has to get the corporation to revisit its policies. I think retaliation is one way to look at it. I think it's also what it could be is an invitation to come to the table to talk about the specifics of what is most appropriate to be included. So part of the problem that I see with both the push for what people are calling wokeness, right, and the push against an awareness of social injustices and a drive to change those injustices quickly is this idea that there is a battle that is happening and there is not a compromise and a conversation about what is appropriate under what circumstances and when. And that is what I would like to see more of, is that parents are better informed about why certain curricula is chosen, that they are presented with the age-appropriate, developmentally appropriate rationales for why we are talking about specific issues. And one of the things that I would like to say just off the top is I don't ever want to see a circumstance where the history of Black Americans in this country is married to any other thing that is considered controversial, because what we can't have is for people to be resisting and removing our history from textbooks when it's so incredibly critical to the development, the founding, and the evolution and perfecting of this union.
Well, I have to follow up and ask you, what specifically do you think are the types of, teachings that are going too far that you would recommend be taken away as a compromise? Because a lot of the pushback from the left has been the bill amounts to banning gay teachers from being able to reference the fact that they're gay in the classroom and stuff like that. Can you be more specific about what you think that compromise would look like?
Yeah, and I don't know that I'm suggesting that anything needs to be taken away. And that's part of the problem here is the criteria, right, that the pushback is providing is not clear about what they feel is inappropriate or what they feel is going too far, as well as those who are implementing the curricula haven't, I think, done a thorough job of pulling parents into and educators into the conversation, the evolution about why we are approaching it the way that they are. So it's just a push back and forth. I will say that from what I have read about the Don't Say Gay bill, about the pushback there is really about younger children between, I think it's kindergarten through 3rd grade, as well as some of the content that is being discussed, particularly in regard to sex education. And of course, they've married critical race theory, the resistance to that with it. And so to me, I think we are asking our society to evolve very rapidly. Nothing wrong with that, because for me, transformative leadership is about quick change. However, we also have to realize there are very significant pockets of our society where the very things we are talking about are themselves demonized. The idea of being woke, for example, the idea that you're a social justice warrior is legitimately critiqued. And so we need to both educate the adults as well as educating the children. And I think there's just been an implementation failure in how all of that has happened. happened that has caused a lot of the pushback. And let's be real, we are not going to get 100% of people to go, oh, okay, I get it now. Yeah, let's do that. But what is the best way to help people understand what is happening? And are there any parts of the curricula that maybe do go too far at a young age?
Well, Max, what do you think? Is this about bringing the broad left to the table, using redistricting, splitting a black district as a way to have a conversation that the left maybe isn't willing to have about the kind of overreaches that may or may not be happening in schools? Or is just a pretext to keep, drawing districts in a way that is electorally advantageous to Republicans?
The second one. I mean, and to be fair, if, the people in power were as thoughtful and conscientious as Denise, my answer might be different. But the fact is they're not, right? I mean, I think that Ron DeSantis, I can say quite confidently that, yes, this is retaliation because that's how Ron DeSantis operates. He's very much a Republican in the Trumpian mold. And we actually had a great interview a couple months ago on the Real News Network for the Mark Steiner Show with Representative Anna Eskamani about how you can kind of track DeSantis's political trajectory across this sort of culture war, own the libs kind of style, right? Because it really stirs up the base. But the problem is that it can have really disastrous effects that end up hurting working Floridians, regardless of their color, regardless of where in the state that they live. And that, is my main sort of critique, is that, like Denise said, I also, grew up conservative as a person of color. I definitely understand and acknowledge that there are very real concerns that people can have against things like what they call wokeness or what we perceive to be social justice warriors. I felt that myself. But the problem is, as I said, the more that you go on, the more that you realize that those political issues end up sort of becoming the focus at the expense of the things that really materially impact your life. And, just to give kind of two important caveats as we continue to wade into this discussion, right? Because another thing Denise said is that we don't want to be erasing history. That's already happening in Florida. The Stop Woke Act is already having impacts of people being censored or censoring themselves. Michael Sinata wrote a great column at The Real News about how academics and teachers are already getting censored because of the Stop Woke Act before it was actually signed into law. But here's the thing. When it comes to the quote unquote "Don't Say Gay" bill, DeSantis and Republicans are constantly stressing the fact that, this is reasonable because what we're saying is that you can't have, any sort of lessons that reference gender identity between kindergarten and third grade. Who would disagree with that? Kindergartners are little kids. They're playing around. Why do they need to learn about that, right? So it seems innocuous. But if you look closer at the bill, there are two things to point out. One is that there are provisions about, lessons that are developmentally or age appropriate that extend well beyond the third grade, and that people in Florida are already looking for ways to sort of apply that to other realms of K through 12 education. The second is, just like the abortion bills, just like the other anti-LGBTQ bills in the United States, this is spawning more bills like it and worse bills in other states around the country. Kansas is looking at a similar bill that would outlaw any materials depicting homosexuality of any kind, not even sexual. Just like if you show two gay people, that is illegal. Tennessee, Indiana, these types of bills are cropping up all over the place. So it's not a contained thing to Florida. It's not about, just limiting this from kindergarten to third grade. It's a way of getting in the door to expand this sort of attack on perceived quote unquote wokeness that isn't actually addressing the real things that Floridians are desperately need to address. This is the last thing I'll say, and I'll shut up, because we can't be talking about this unless we acknowledge the fact that Florida ranks second in the United States as the state with the highest income inequality, behind I think Wyoming. That there's things like a nursing home crisis that legislators are actively creating by basically eliminating safe nursing to patient ratios, and unions have been decrying this for a while. And Miami is going to basically be underwater in our lifetimes. There are a lot of really pressing issues in Florida that we are not focusing on because DeSantis is really whipping up these culture war sentiments, which, as Denise said, may stem from legitimate places, but they're not actually addressing the things that are hurting working Floridians.
Yeah, I think that's a solid point there, Max. Well, meanwhile, Colorado Governor Jared Polis is welcoming companies like Disney and Twitter in. It feels like here's a tweet that we have up here. Florida's authoritarian socialist attacks on the private sector are driving business away. In Colorado, we don't meddle in affairs of companies like Disney or Twitter. Hey, Disney, we're ready for Mountain Disneyland. And Twitter, we're ready for Twitter HQ2, whoever your owners are. I don't know, climate-wise, if we're going to want to do snow time, winter Disney. I don't know, maybe there could be an appetite for it. But, Denise, what do you make of these kinds of bids? Is it just cynical?
Well, I mean, I think I appreciated, frankly, his sort of gangster in tweeting that, honestly. And I think, so for me, looking at all of this, the idea is, how do we come to the table for a resolution? I am not interested in endless banter, endless pushback, this sort of tug of war thing. I want to get to a resolution. And so if the governor of Colorado, advertising to large businesses in a state that is also taking a position on this, gets people to come to the table and have a real discussion about what is important. What are we teaching our children about these very important social issues, and at what age is appropriate to teach what? That should always be the focus. And if we allow folks to play these political footballs where they're flexing their muscle at each other, we're missing the whole point. So we, the people, need to be keeping their eyes on the ball and saying, does this get us closer to the table at looking at what it is we're teaching and when? Because that is the whole point. I think, to Max's point earlier, this idea of some of the critique that was happening and some of the things that are in the law, like this unsolicited strategies. I don't even know what that means. I'm assuming it's operationally defined somewhere in the small print, but I don't know what it means that you can outlaw or reject curricula based on unsolicited strategies. I'm assuming if the parents don't want it, then you can't teach it. And if that is the criteria that we're going to use, I would be afraid that we're at the time of civil rights, where maybe 6 of 10 white Americans were like kind of okay with civil rights. Would we even be able to have this conversation today? So there are ways in which I absolutely support parental involvement in the process of educating children, and even the decision about what and when, but that needs to be a dialogue and a conversation. And we also need to really include our kids in these conversations as well. And I can tell you as a parent that what I knew at 8 is a lot different than what my children and their peers were exposed to at 8 years of age. And part of that is because of technology and what their peers exposed them to as well.
Well, Max, you made this point that this is all a bait and switch from focusing on some of the more substantive, economic material issues that are going on in the state. I will never forget that Florida is a state where Trump won and also at the same time passed a $15 minimum wage, approved a $15 minimum wage ballot measure with 60% of the vote. I mean, when you see a more liberal state, like Colorado saying, okay, my response to these bills is to say, just come here and move here. Is there a part of you that wishes there was a conversation at that moment about how, hey, I should be able to draw you and your workers and your interests here, not because of, tax breaks or to posture over a kind of an anti-wokeness bill, but to say we can actually offer a better standard of life and living here because we have a better social safety net, because we respect our citizens, because we pay our laborers a fair wage, those kinds of conversations.
Oh man, I got caught for a second being like, oh, wouldn't that be a beautiful America to live in? It's because the sad thing is that I think that, yeah, that would be great. The problem is that we've consistently gone in the opposite direction, right? I mean, where states essentially vie with each other to entice corporations to move there by, like I said, going in the opposite direction, by offering fewer regulations and protections and social safety nets for workers. I grew up in California. This is the battle that we always had with Arizona and Texas. They said, hey, if you don't want to be regulated, come over here. We'll let you, kind of set up shop and do whatever the hell you want. There's longstanding precedent for this in the United States. Before many corporations, through the open doors of free trade agreements in the era of neoliberalism, were able to move to other countries and take advantage of cheap labor sources and fewer environmental regulations and worker protections in places like Mexico and so on and so forth. Before they did that, a lot of corporations went to the South because the South was very anti-union. There were a lot of anti-union kind of built-in structures in the law that enabled companies to operate at cheaper costs than they would in more unionized parts of the country. So like I said, we kind of, incentivize business in other states by essentially always undercutting workers. And that is what is endlessly frustrating for me. But I'll tell you something. And I imagine both of you kind of felt the same way when you were reading about the DeSantis stuff, is there does seem to be something kind of paradigm shifting here on the right? Because as I think the article mentioned, a lot of these sweetheart deals that corporations get with huge tax breaks, with huge, public funds that go towards building their infrastructure and yada, yada, yada. A lot of that has been a staple of the right-wing strategy to say that, like, we are the ones who bring the job creators to the state. We deliver jobs to people. DeSantis is actively going against what I think is the #1 private employer in his state, which is really significant. And I also think, as much as I hate to say, it feels kind of smart. It's a gamble, but it could actually work because he's been looking for a convenient target to pit his anti-wokeness to, what I see as a very anti-worker sort of agenda. And in Disney, he has found it. And Disney is such a massive and incredibly wealthy and powerful corporation that it's hard to sympathize with it, right? And so people may not actually be that sympathetic if DeSantis is going after a company that was essentially allowed to have its own sovereign territory in the state, right? And so I do wonder where this will go. But obviously, first and foremost, I'm thinking about all the workers, especially many Black and Latino workers who are employed by Disney in the state, what this will mean for them. And I honestly don't know where it will go, but I think it is significant and an evolution in the kind of quote unquote populist right strategy that doesn't fit to the old Republican paradigms that we grew up with.
Well, I look forward to continuing this conversation with both of you. Thank you, Max. Thank you, Denise, for joining me today.
Thank you. Good to see you.
We'll have more Rising after this.